If you're in the US, you might have recently heard someone say that guns don't kill people, people kill people. Or perhaps that the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Perhaps you've even made these arguments yourself. But there's an assumption to these arguments, and it's that traits about a person matter more than the context in determining whether someone will do something violent. As a psychologist, that assumption worries me, not least of which because of something called the fundamental attribution error. This refers to a bias that people have that leads them to explain their own behavior differently than they explain other people's behavior. Watching others, we tend to say that it's character traits that cause behavior. But when we explain our own actions, we tend to rely a lot more on the context and the situation. This makes sense because we can't see all the context that's in other people's minds when they're making decisions, but we do know our own. And since we're naturally a little more inclined to ignore how context shapes other people's choices, we may not stop to consider whether the context can make good people behave badly or even violently. But some famous psychological studies might help answer that question. For example, you might have heard of the famous experiments conducted by Stanley Milgram regarding conformity to social pressure. In these studies, they told participants they were studying memory, and asked them to give another person a memory test and punish them for wrong answers, using a machine that gave them electrical shocks. The more frequent the wrong answers, the bigger the shock, with a warning of XXX danger severe shock down at the far end. What the participants didn't know was that the other person was an actor, and the shocks were faked. So what percent of people were willing to give a stranger a shock at the high end? 63% of people. In some experiments, they pushed it as high as 90%. Now, this isn't because the majority of the population is secretly harboring sadistic desires to do deadly harm to other people, but it wasn't because the participants were threatened to comply either. The context just told them it was okay, and a man with a white lab coat and a clipboard said,
"The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue." 375 volts.
Or consider the famous study conducted by Philip Zimbardo at Stanford, in which college students were randomly assigned to act as either prison guards or prison inmates. He wanted to see if just being placed in a powerful role could change people's behavior, and if that role could lead them to behave abusively. And the students were selected because of their emotional stability, so he thought it might take 2 weeks to change their behavior. Instead, he ended the study after 5 days because the students took to the power of the role so well, enforcing humiliating and sexualized abuse. Some treated prisoners as if they were despicable animals, taking pleasure in cruelty. These were people chosen for being normal and average on clinical and personality tests.
I had really thought that I was incapable of this kind of behavior. And while I was doing it, I didn't feel any regret. I didn't feel any guilt. It was only afterwards when I began to reflect on what I had done that this was a part of me I hadn't really noticed before.
Of the experience, Zimbardo said that he himself didn't recognize what he was doing. "I didn't know it was out of control," he said. "I was totally indifferent. It took someone from outside the experiment telling him he needed to shut it down to make him realize the harm that he was causing, even when explicitly looking for the effects of context on behavior. You can be blind to it yourself." Now, admittedly, these studies were done decades ago, and scientific ethics boards don't permit this kind of study anymore, partially because we now realize the harm that even temporarily creating these kinds of situations can cause. But we still permit studies of other kinds of immoral behavior, like cheating. And in studies in which students were rewarded in cash for scores on tests, but some had an obvious opportunity to cheat while others didn't, many took the opportunity. The researcher, Dan Ariely, said it wasn't as if there was a few bad apples, a few people cheated a lot. Instead, what we saw is a lot of people who cheat a little bit. Now, you might want to make the case that even though the context matters for some, there are others for whom the context is less relevant. Even in the most extreme case of Milgram's experiments, there were still 10% who were unwilling to give a stranger an electric shock. And there are some rare clinical conditions that lead people to have malicious, violent, or abusive intent regardless of the context. But the vast majority of us fall in the middle. Understanding this might help explain why having more firearms in a country is positively correlated with more death from firearms, even after controlling for population. If good people having guns was what stopped bad people, you'd see the opposite. But the context, just having the guns around, giving people that powerful role, could be the bigger influence. I don't know the best way to regulate weapons to reduce violent deaths in this country, but I do know that whatever the solution is won't be found by drawing a line between good and bad people, because that line can't be found. To quote Alexander Solzhenitsyn, "If only it were all so simple, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?" Thanks for watching. See you next time.